we have experienced and lived through so that we do not make the same mistakes again. And today I've been asked to speak of inclusive leadership in real time. And my first experience of inclusive leadership was actually during the dying days of apartheid in the late 1980s, when we had talks about talks between the liberation movements of South Africa and the then apartheid regime of the nationalist government. And certainly at that time I was fairly young, I was junior, I was not influential at all, and I'm still not influential. But the talk about talks took place over a number of years, facilitated in third countries on the African continent as well as in Europe. And we had many friends then who, through their civil society activism, social activism, economic disinvestment, and sanctions, even here in the United States, were able to bring pressure to bear upon the then South African government to say, you ought to go and have a negotiated settlement. This is one of the only ways you are going to be able to bring about sustainable peace and avoid a civil war. And so it was really during these dark days that the nationalist government chose to hold a referendum amongst the white South Africans, the electorate. The rest of us were disenfranchised, so we had no say in whatever the white South Africa was going to decide. And so the people were then given a choice. Do you support dialogue and a negotiated settlement with the liberation movements or not? And, of course, the outcome was positive, even though by a small margin, because it was for economic reasons, not so much that people stopped believing in apartheid or holding that type of a value system. They were still racist, but it was hurting them in the pocket because of global action, because a number of very important organizations, companies, voices, civil rights movements here in the US of A had all come together to ensure that they came to the table and started talking. So we then had the unbanning of the liberation movements, and we then had prolonged negotiations which led us to our first national democratic elections in 1994 that saw President Nelson Mandela ascend to power in the presidency. That was a government that was illegitimate, it was unrepresentative, yet they went to referendum to ask their constituency which direction they wanted to go in. And that was then the first experience of inclusive leadership, but at that time we didn't phrase it in that context. Ironically, during President Mandela's term in office, because of the armed struggle, many of our liberation movements were also classified around the world as terrorist organizations. And so Nelson Mandela remained on the list of terrorists who was prohibited from entering the United States of America. So this was during the days of a democratic government under President Clinton. Even though he was, of course, given a special pardon to come in when he had to, and then leave again. But it was some time thereafter that I think Congress repealed having him on that list of prohibited persons. Now, when we speak of collective, inclusive leadership, we cannot do so unless we have inclusive democracy. Democracy has various definitions. It comes in various shades and forms. And I'm told also that you're all Democrats here. Or should I rephrase that we all believe in democracy, but we are not necessarily Democrats. Well, with my presence in the United States after 26 years, and November 8th coming up in a week's time or less, I take no responsibility for what would happen on November 9th. But I think what is key is if we are to be speaking of leadership, every leader has to be representing someone, some group of people. And who are these groups of people that the leaders represent? Do the leaders come from within that group? Yesterday, someone spoke of poverty, and those who grow up in poverty, who were disenfranchised and struggled their entire lives to make it a success, they would probably, through their life experiences, have a worldview that would be more relevant and more accepting, and therefore they would be more understanding and would empathize with those who still are facing similar plights. The advent of technology, mobile phones, the internet, the computers as we know it today, has certainly changed a lot, politically, socially, and economically. If we think about the manner in which people today are able to make their voices heard, it can be done in an instant, the snap of your fingers, because of our access to social media and all forms of technology, where the voiceless now are able to express themselves and mobilize. If we think of the challenges we face as humanity, there are far too many amongst us who feel excluded, marginalized, outside of the mainstream. And hence, we can see 25 years after the end of the Cold War, with globalization, which Cynthia spoke of, we can see that the promises that were made are not being delivered. They're not a reality to the majority of the people. You will recall that we had a movement in the US where there were people who made up the 99%ers, and these 99%ers wanted their voices to be heard because they were not receiving any of the benefits of the system of governance that is in existence. If you take at local, national, international level, the political system of governance we have, the economic system of governance, we can see that these are outdated. They are no longer relevant. People who are resorting to desperate acts, who are becoming extremists, who are being radicalized, are protesting. They are protesting. They are revolting against a failed system. Now, if we look at the global leadership, we are in crisis. You think of 50 years ago, you think of the past century, and immediately you'd come up with a number of names on your fingertips who had a global impact, who were visionaries, who held the moral high ground, who identified with causes that all of us could identify with. And when they spoke, we could say they were speaking on our behalf as well. And today, if we can find any such leaders, we would be lucky. What is it, all of us gathered here, regardless of our backgrounds, regardless of our qualifications, what is it that we bring to the leadership debate? We may be accomplished as academics, as researchers, as civil society and social activists, as senior executives in the corporate sector. But what is it that we contribute as agents of social change? And this, I think, is a key question that we need to address, we need to answer. We have seen politically the world over that there has been a tendency for leaders to serve themselves rather than the interests of the people. As a practitioner, as a diplomat, I negotiate. I try to find solutions wherever possible. Find middle ground, compromise. But it's usually interests versus principles. You can't have it both. What do you hold on to? Do you negotiate on your principles or your interest? Interestingly, just the day before yesterday, I was reading on electronic media that a soft drink company headquartered in Atlanta has had its email hacked into, and the communication on a global strategy to conduct warfare on sugar tax was going to be launched. It may not be in the US, it could be in other parts of the world. And now there is some damage control that is being done. But this company is also known for contributing huge sums of money to worthy causes. How do we deal with this? You've got a brand people associate with, they hold in high regard. This brand is constantly contributing towards good causes, bringing communities up, etc. And then you find that something like this is exposed. how much would it change our opinion and our views of such practices? Let me assure you, the corporate sector is not all that it seems, just as governments aren't all that they seem. Cynthia has mentioned that the phenomenon of globalization, which aimed to promote free trade, free movement of goods, services, people, it was supposed to bring us all closer together. It was supposed to give us a better life, socially and economically. But today we find that we are less cohesive than we thought we would be. The glue which we imagine that binds us together is not there. It is being corroded constantly by irrational fears and inhumane conduct. Since the New World Order, which was emerging in the 1990s, we expected that we were going to have a much better, improved global system of governance, politically, socially, culturally, economically, etc. But bold, courageous leadership escaped us when the moment was ripe. We all know of the efforts and the attempts to reform the United Nations, and that was at the turn of the century. It ended up being a non-event, and we're going to live with the consequences of that non-event for some time to come. Let's fast forward from the turn of the century, and we recall popular uprisings such as the Orange and the Velvet Revolutions, the Arab Spring of a few years ago, 6 years ago. So the majority of these citizens are rising up against unfair systems of governance. They don't want to live in poverty, be unemployed, constantly begging for assistance, have their dignity, self-esteem, self-worth eroded. Many people during this current financial and economic global crisis have taken their own lives. And this has happened in Europe. Europe is not supposed to experience poverty or hunger or starvation. That is reserved for Africa. But today, we have poverty, hunger, and starvation amongst European countries and European people. And these people have lost everything they ever worked for, their entire lives. Whatever meager savings they had, they lost their jobs, they lost their pension, their homes, and with it, their pride and dignity. And so we find in many countries, particularly in Southern Europe, which were hit the hardest by the global crisis, people took their own lives as the only means of escape from that reality. And who do we hold responsible for that? Remember when we spoke convincingly of free market economies, unregulated, job creation coming through private sector investment and so forth? Well, if you open any newspaper on any given day, you are bound to come across some scandal or crisis that has been created because people did not play by the rules. So, governance is extremely important. whether it's political governance, whether it is corporate governance, financial governance. I think the most recent case here in the US has been the Wells Fargo case. We've seen Barclays in the UK, HSBC, Northern Rock, and who knows how many other financial institutions going into crisis mode. So the question is, with all the financial resources in the world and the ocean of goodwill that is present in the world and even in this room, what happens when the promise of a fairer distribution of wealth falls short? In poorer parts of the world, the majority of the population are excluded completely from benefiting from the economies of their countries. The situation is no better when looking at the comparisons between developed and developing countries. And this is to remain so as the developing world is condemned to remaining at the bottom of the feeding chain. Who amongst us cannot sympathize with or empathize with the Occupy Wall Street movement? I'm sure some of you have even participated in the various hashtag must fall movements. There's the Black Lives Matter movement as well. These are all causes that are becoming rallying points for people who are dissatisfied and disillusioned with the current status of leadership. And we have to change that. Would it not be great if we had evolved as humanity to the stage where we could have a movement that would be hashtag every life matters? Right now in the media you will find there's a lot of opposition to mega trade deals, the one between the US and the EU, which is called the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership Agreement, TTIP. There's the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, that the US is negotiating with the Pacific countries. There was the Canadian mega trade deal with the EU, which had been blocked, but now it seems as if it's going to go ahead and be signed. With all of these, where would the majority of our society and citizens be? Who would these mega trade deals benefit? Will that benefit permeate downwards? Will there be any trickling down of those? If we look at the current election campaign here in the US, we know that a large number of the electorate had sought to endorse candidates or support candidates who were outsiders rather than insiders. Why would a man like Bernie Sanders get so much of support? Who was he representing? Was he the voice of the voiceless? We know that right now we've got the two candidates for the Republicans and the Democrats, and God help us all on the 9th of November. But it begs the question, are our democracies perfect? How do we make our democracies more inclusive? Where do we find leaders who still can be described as honest, morally upstanding, ethical, clean, no skeletons in the cupboards, visionary, and being servants? I think that is the key. We cannot afford to say, well, when we become leaders, we occupy very high positions, very high office, and therefore we cannot identify with or represent the interests of the poor. When we speak of environmental issues, we look forward to the outcomes of the conferences on climate change at the end of each year. In a few weeks' time, it's going to be in Marrakesh in Morocco. How are we as individuals or as a group, an organization, a collective, shaping that discussion and that debate? Where do we position ourselves in such discourses? In Africa, when we negotiate with our partners would love for us to concentrate on matters of good governance, democracy, and human rights before we are offered any type of assistance. And as much as African countries, 55 of them, are not perfect, they are not the same. The circumstances within which they operate, the history of the country, makes it such that there are unique and specific types of governance models that are put into practice. Many are constitutional democracies, but even constitutions can be subverted. They can be amended to become undemocratic. These are the tricks of the trade that only politicians know best. We have challenges in Africa, but sometimes we would like to be also the solution seekers for our problems and would love the support of those who can understand where we come from and where we would like to go to. We've often been promised that with reforms you will have a lot of investment that will come into your country, your economies can grow and it would create jobs for your people, and so they would be upwardly mobile, and of course we would find your people would be having a much higher and better standard of living. But the question we have to ask ourselves is it the same companies which evade paying taxes, particularly in African countries where a private sector company can be worth 10 times the annual budget of that country? I think we are all aware that some of our, let's say, technology companies are worth billions and even hundreds of billions of US dollars. And you come to a small, poor African country, and the entire annual budget for that country, for the government, could be about 300 million US dollars. So you bring in this huge company with this financial muscle to come and negotiate with a poor government in a poor country. Who's going to win the negotiating round? This is the reality. And so we have to be aware that in as much as we want to be pragmatic and realistic, there are certain factors which would, of course, not permit anything to be done differently. It reminds me of movies like Wag the Dog. I don't know if any of you can recall the movie called Wag the Dog. It was made a few decades ago. More recently, The Wolf of Wall Street. And I saw a movie on the way here called Money Monster. And it gives you a different insight into how things get done on the stock exchange and so forth. But the point that I wanted to make, and I can see that I'm really torturing you after 30 minutes of speaking. The point I wanted to make was that we need to revisit where we have fallen short and what needs to change. Do we maintain the status quo, the systems of governance that are there, or do we improve on them? Do we take that courageous step and we get things changed? It's always difficult. There's a lot of trepidation and anxiety when we want to move towards the unknown. But if we don't try any new ways, we're going to be exactly where we are in 10, 20, or 30 years' time, and we would be probably encouraging more popular uprisings, even in countries which are deemed to be stable and progressive. The world can no longer accept inequality, poverty. If there is a system which keeps certain countries, certain continents at the bottom, and others can step on it so that they can progress, that's unfair. We ought to say it. Because then we are simply providing fertile grounds and reasons for people, more people, to become extremist in their views, to become more radical, and to seek solutions outside of the democratically acceptable channels. Next year's conference in Brussels is going to address the same leadership crisis. So I thought I should plant the seeds now so that it germinates over the next year, and perhaps by the time participants to the conference in Brussels arrive there, they would have applied their minds to what needs to be done differently, even by the ILA. And I want to invite Cynthia and the board of the ILA to consider even hosting a conference somewhere in Africa. I think that would be wonderful. There would be many countries, many leadership associations or academies in Africa that could be approached, and if you need any assistance and if I can help, please do give me a shout. And I think to groom leadership in a continent like Africa would be great. I want to close with, and now I have to put my reading glasses on. I wanted to just read something which was written by Frantz Fanon. And I quote, "Sometimes people hold a core belief that is very strong. When they are presented with evidence that works against that belief, the new evidence cannot be accepted. It would create a feeling that is extremely uncomfortable, called cognitive dissonance. And because it is so important to protect the core belief, they will rationalize, ignore, and even deny anything that doesn't fit in with the core belief," unquote. What we have to ask ourselves is, do we fall in this definition of cognitive dissonance or not? So with those few words, and having held you captive for exactly 40 minutes, I thank you very much for your kind attention, and I hope I did not bore you too much. But I also wish to once again thank Cynthia and the ILA for inviting me to speak to you and to share with you a few thoughts about the direction in which we should take the leadership debate. Thank you very much indeed.